with your God. This is the word of the Lord. We say together, thanks be to God. I'm going to invite Laura and Hannah to come and share with us this morning.
What people call you here. Ruben. I am actually going to take this mic, I think. Thank you for having us. As I was driving out here today, it was a bit earlier than most of you arrived, and I came from Waterloo, and the golden sun was just filling the golden wheat fields with sun, and it was reflecting everywhere, and it was beautiful. And I just felt this song rise up in me that I hadn't thought of for a little while. I'm going to try really hard not to cry today because it's a hard topic, but it was one that I believe you are all familiar with because I know Ruben's heart for camp, and I grew up at one of the Presbyterian camps, and it was, I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, oh my soul rejoice. And every time I've heard that song in the past, I've heard it as I'm singing and I'm lifting my voice to you. But as I repeated it over and over and over on my half-hour drive here, it changed for me, and it became, I lift my voice in this way, to speak up for justice and for peace. And it really moved me. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to raise our voice as a form of worship for God, to share the stories that we've learned when the Presbyterian Church of Canada sent us to Israel and Palestine as their representatives to a young adults conference. As Ruben mentioned, I'm a professional photographer, so many of the images in this are my own. However, there are some that Laura provided and others that we received from journalists who are currently on the ground in Gaza, and those are marked. I'd like to begin by speaking about the language we'll be using today, because it's important that we have clarity on that as we move forward. So Israel, when we talk about that, is the current political state of Israel, the government of Israel, or the Israeli army. Israeli is the citizens of Israel. And it's interesting to note that 73% of citizens of Israel are Jewish, and 20% are Muslim and Christian. So not all Israelis are Jewish. We met many who are also not. Palestinians are of Palestinian descent, made up of both Muslim and Christian backgrounds. And the Jewish faith, obviously, is the ancestry of that, as well as the faith. Zionism is a movement for the development of a purely Jewish state, which actually started far earlier than 1948. I'd also like to talk about the land, the history of the land, before we really share what we witnessed there, because understanding the history of it is important in understanding what we walked into in 2009 and 2008 for Laura. So as you can see here, in 1947, this is what Palestine looked like. The white spots that you see there are Jewish settlements. And I think it's interesting to note that my mother was born in 1947. So this is not ancient history, as I'm sure some of you were even alive then. The plan that the UN pitched in 1947 is the second map there. And this is what they suggested as a place for settling the Jewish population that was leaving Europe during the Holocaust, as well as actually a lot of immigrants came from other Arab countries that were Jewish in order to come into Israel. And it's also interesting to note that in that time and in the probably 50 years leading up to it, other countries were also considered for this property, or other countries were considered as places to establish the state of Israel, including Uganda, I'm blanking on the countries now, Tasmania, and one other. If you have a question about that after, I'll let you know. But they ultimately decided on this area because it is, of course, the historic state area where Israel was in the Bible times. In 1949, so by the time my mom was 2, this is actually what Palestine and Israel looked like in the third map. So in those 2 years, you can see that the Palestinians were pushed into 2 areas, and the rest of the state became Israel. I will be sharing a bit about how that happened, and you can see in 2005 is the most recent updated map that we have, and that is showing the West Bank. A lot of the time when we were there, it was referred to as a Swiss cheese state because there are so many holes in what the UN originally pitched as the land that would remain as Palestine. So speaking to the Nakba, on that map you saw how much land moved from being Palestinian to being Israeli, and that happened through what the Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, which actually translates as catastrophe because it was so traumatic for them. Palestinians were told to flee due to the violence, and they were actually assured that they would be allowed to return when the violence subsided. This was one of the strategies that the Zionist movement used to clear the land of the Palestinians, and many of those survivors of the Nakba actually recalled to us that they fled so quickly that they left hot meals on the table and grabbed literally whatever they could to escape the violence and left with their keys with the intent of returning home. I'd like to share an account with you from the granddaughter of a Jewish woman who survived the Holocaust. This was shared on social media recently. And she says, "When my grandmother arrived here after the Holocaust," speaking about Israel, the Jewish agency promised her a house. She had nothing. Her entire family was exterminated. She waited for a long time in a tent in an extremely precarious situation. Then they took her to Ajam in Haifa and in a beautiful beach house. She saw that on the table there were still the dishes of the Arabs who had lived there and who had been kicked away. So she went back to the agency and said, "Take me back to the tent. I will never do to anyone else what was done to me. This is my legacy." But not everyone made that choice. How could we have become what we opposed? That is the big question. So I would like to point out that not all people were okay, not all of the Jewish people fleeing the Holocaust were okay seeing what had happened. And there are 2 stances that they tend to share, which is, you've heard never again. And some of them believe never again for us, and others believe never again for anyone. And you'll see that a lot in even the opinions that Jewish communities are sharing right now. So during the Nakba, in total, 530 plus villages were completely destroyed of Palestinians. 15,000 Palestinians were killed, and 750,000 Palestinians were forcefully displaced. I took this photo from the bus while we were touring through Israel and Palestine, and you can see in the bottom there are many abandoned homes, and this is just one of the many villages that we saw that had been destroyed in the original Nakba, and they're remaining, as you can see, uninhabited. And we also see cacti around the area, and that's another signal that that's an area that had been raised and is not developed yet. The land remaining as Palestinian territory, as you saw on the map, is 22% of what it once was. This land was divided into what is now the West Bank. In the middle map, you can see the big chunk of green, and the little bit of green is Gaza. So those are the territories that we are going to be speaking about today. Throughout my time in Israel and Palestine, I frequently met Palestinians and Israelis working for peace, but we do continue to see the forceful removal of Palestinians from their homes. This is a family that we met in East Jerusalem, which is designated as Palestinian territory, and the family shared their story of the night that the Israeli army came and forcefully removed them from their beds as they slept. And it was actually so traumatic for them that the father died of a heart attack. By morning, an Israeli family had been moved in. So their neighbors went to bed with them there, and they woke up to an Israeli family having been moved in. You can actually see their home. If you look very closely, the very far right, there's a home that's covered in tiny little Israeli flags. That was their home. And so they set up this tent as a form of peaceful resistance, which you'll often see all throughout Palestinian resistance. The majority of it is peaceful. And this tent had been knocked down many times by the Israeli army, saying that they cannot build there. However, this is private land, and the owner of the land has given them permission to be there. Later this same week, we drove past there again, and the tent had once again been removed. We also bore witness to home demolitions, house demolitions, and this is also something that is very common. It happens about once a day, about 6 times a week, and it continues to this day. The rate at which it happens is actually small enough that it doesn't catch the attention of the international community, but it is big enough that it imposes this fear of the unknown, like what is going to happen tomorrow for the Palestinians. And one of the stories shared with us was a little boy who was home. I think he was like 10 or 12. His sisters had gone to school, his parents had gone to work, and he was about to leave for school. The Israeli army showed up while he was finishing his cereal, told him that they had 20 minutes to get out of the house before it would be demolished. And he was there alone, and I mean, you can't really stop an army from demolishing your house. And so he still carries that weight of not being able to protect his family and their home from that terrible experience. And most of the Palestinians, all of the Palestinians whose homes are demolished, are then footed with the bill by the Israeli army, and it is typically in the tens of thousands. I had the pleasure of working with the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, because again, not all Israelis agree with what their government is doing. This is Jeffrey Helper, he's the founder of it, and what their group does and what we helped with is rebuilding Palestinian homes that have been demolished as a form of peaceful resistance. And they do this very frequently because, again, there's one demolished almost every day of the week. Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions also provides live time maps of the demolitions that have been happening. This is a map just from January 2023 until August 2023. And you can see on the right, the numbers might be a little bit small, but 203 agricultural structures have been demolished. Inhabited residents, 210 have been demolished. And what I found, horrifying, is that entire villages, 4 have been demolished just since January until August. So this is a very real situation that Palestinians live with every day. And reminder, I was there 14 years ago and witnessed it, and it hasn't stopped. And if you want any of these stats, you can go to their website, and the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions records all of this. So house demolitions and removing Palestinians forcefully from their homes are 2 aspects of daily life under occupation. The other 3 that I'm going to quickly highlight are the separation wall, checkpoints, and segregation. So, the illegal separation wall, this was my very first view of it as we approached it on our bus. It was very imposing, very huge, and much bigger than I ever thought. Not that I gave it much thought, to be honest, before this trip. It looks like a military base? I don't even know. You can see it. But it really struck me, obviously, because I felt it worth photographing. And it's often described as an element of racial segregation. It was built by Israel in the early 2000s, and international courts have deemed it illegal and actually demanded that it be demolished and torn down, which hasn't happened. On this next slide, you'll see the map of it. I'll also point out Bethlehem and Jericho are actually within the West Bank. And the green line that you see around the exterior of the West Bank is the actual border of West Bank. And the red line is where the wall goes. So you'll see it does not follow the green border set out by the UN. Rather, it actually annexes very specific cities and towns that should be within Palestinian territory. One of the things that really struck me, oh good, my screen on the back was really bright, and I'm like, I hope you can see this picture. In the middle of it, of the photograph, you'll see a single house. And when I saw that, I just couldn't believe that this is what happens, but you'll see another one on the left, and this happens very frequently with the wall, is that the wall annexes cities, but it also cuts individual houses off from their entire villages. And it also cuts off farmers from their farmland. It cuts off the population from access to their schools, workplaces, medical facilities, and it just complicates life for all of the Palestinians. And those who are on the inside of the wall and work on the other side actually have Israeli visas as work permits, and they need to wake up really early in the morning to go through these checkpoints. One of the stories that was shared with us by a young woman was that she actually has to wake up at 4 a.m. to ensure that she can get through all the checkpoints, if they're even open, to get to a class for 10 a.m. So a lot of what we witnessed was actually just trying to make their lives so difficult that they would actually want to leave because it's just so unpredictable and hard. One of the phrases we often heard was inshallah, which means God willing. Like, God willing, I'll see you at the movies tonight, or God willing, I'll be able to get to school to write my exam tomorrow. Pretty much every plan ends with inshallah, because you just don't know. And the number of Palestinians who have work permits to go into Israel to work are in the tens of thousands. So I'm not just talking about hundreds of people here. There are actually 140 checkpoints all throughout the West Bank, and they're often connecting Palestinian villages and within the Palestinian villages. One story that we heard was that a checkpoint was built right outside of one of the Palestinian homes, and that meant that every time they left their home or returned home, they had to cross through this checkpoint, which are mainly run either by the Israeli army or by hired security services by the Israeli army. A friend of mine also shared about her school, her most beloved teacher. And this teacher suffered from asthma. And this is a story that we heard over and over, is that when this teacher had an asthma attack, they were able to get in the ambulance, but the ambulance was stopped at a checkpoint. And they held them at the checkpoint and then until the teacher died. So there are ways that they use the checkpoints to actually oppress the people so that they cannot get the medical attention they need. The same story goes with women giving birth at checkpoints. The number of babies, I mean, you can Google it. It was very high. And they're not just like friendly little checkpoints all the time. Sometimes they look like this. And again, it takes hours to get through. The segregation, I've already covered some of the ways that segregation happens. This is another area in Hebron, which is one of the most highly populated by the Israeli army. And there are also settlements built above the Palestinian marketplaces. So you'll see in this bottom left image and the bottom right image, the Israeli army has actually blockaded many of the areas that once were lively marketplaces to kill off like any kind of trade and community and things like that. And now those streets are very desolate. This is another shot from Hebron. You'll see me, actually. I'm off in the left there behind the woman in the turquoise. I have a headscarf on. And we were all forced to walk on that little side on the left, and the entire street area is reserved only for Israelis. And we saw things like this pretty frequently. Now, Laura and I tried to go to Gaza in 2009. We even had international permission from all of the governments required and flew over to Cairo, and upon arrival, we were denied entry, which is pretty common for Gaza. So I have not had the opportunity to go there, but Laura did, so I'm going to pass this off to her.
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. So as Hannah mentioned, I was able to get into Gaza when I was there in 2008. I was only able to enter for 24 hours. So this is a photo of me at the Erez crossing, which is controlled by Israel. I was traveling with a group of 7 Canadians, and I remember waiting 8 hours to be let in through the military, even though the checkpoint was completely empty. In the end, only half of our group was allowed into Gaza, and they randomly chose passports, and I was just lucky enough that I was chosen to get through. Throughout that experience, it was clear that the military border guards really didn't want us to get into Gaza. I remember, this is a picture of me leaving Gaza and going through the Erez crossing. Just after I went through, they actually canceled my visa to Israel and said, please leave our country now. So I was actually kicked out after being in Gaza. So as I entered, I remember going through intense security, and when I got out of the checkpoint, all I could see were bombed buildings within what they call the no-go zone. As I walked along this path, there was a small tea stand set up, and 2 young men welcomed us to Gaza. So before I talk about my experience there, I wanted to provide some context about Gaza. So it is often referred to as the world's largest open-air prison due to Israel's full control of land, air, and sea borders. It's very, very difficult for people to get out of Gaza. Even fishermen are not allowed to go a certain amount of miles in their boats. The other thing that a lot of people don't know about it is it's very, very small, and it's one of the most densely populated areas in the world. So it's only 41 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide, and there's over 2.3 million people now. So it's very, very densely populated. 60% of the population are under 25, and 50% are children. Many of the refugees from 1948 that Hannah spoke about fled to Gaza and still remain in refugee camps with their descendants there. Because of Israel's control and economic chokehold, over 80% of the population rely on humanitarian aid. Since I've been there, I was there in the summer of 2008. Later that year, Israel carried out a military assault in Gaza later in 2008, then again in 2012, 2014, 2021, and now again in 2023. When I was there, I traveled with the Near East Council of Churches. We visited UN schools, hospitals, economic development projects, churches, and organizations working with people with disabilities. I actually bought this scarf in Gaza City from the Atfaluna Craft Market, which was an income-generating project for hearing-impaired adults there. The picture on the left-hand side with a donkey and a cart was a very, very common sight that I saw when I was there. One of the things Israel limits into Gaza is fuel. So many people travel by carts instead of the cars that they have. The picture on the right-hand side is St. Philip's Church, which is in the Al-Ali Arab Hospital compound, which I visited. It had been bombed by Israel shortly before we arrived, and at the time, they were raising money to fix it. We visited with the surgeons and doctors there and witnessed the electricity blackouts that they consistently had to deal with while trying to support their patients. So this was 15 years ago. It was a long time ago that I was there. I was completely horrified by the human rights violations that I witnessed then, and I am completely devastated and heartbroken by what is happening now. So over the last 6 weeks, more than 12,300 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, including over 5,000 children. Israel has bombed hospitals, churches, mosques, refugee camps, neighborhoods, ambulances, and the relentless bombing continues as we speak right now. These are places that are supposed to be protected under international law, places that families were seeking safety in, and the fact is that nowhere is safe in Gaza. As Hannah mentioned earlier, the Nakba displaced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in 1948, and we continue to see the displacement of Palestinians from their land over the past 75 years. So this displacement right now is continuing on a much larger scale than ever before in Gaza. Earlier in October, 1.2 million Palestinians were forced to move out of the northern part of the Gaza Strip and are now being pushed even further and further south. Just as they did in 1948, families have fled their homes with what they could carry. Many trying to seek refuge in hospitals, mosques, and churches, such as the Al-Ali hospital that I visited. Thousands more are expected to die from starvation, dehydration, and disease if Israel does not let food, medicine, fuel, and water enter into Gaza. The situation could not be more dire. Al-Ali Hospital, the one that I visited, was the last functioning hospital in northern Gaza, and as of yesterday, it has collapsed. As we speak, it has completely run out of medication, anesthesia, and medical supplies, and the operating room is no longer functioning. Last night, I heard the witness of Dr. Ghassan Abu Sita, who is a British Palestinian surgeon. He is a hero, and he mentioned that the hospital is now completely surrounded by Israeli tanks, and that northern Gaza has no more functioning hospitals. He was unfortunately forced to leave yesterday. He says, "It has been a living nightmare, leaving 500 wounded, knowing that there's nothing left for you to be able to do for them. It's just the most heartbreaking thing I have ever had to do." Hannah and I are still in contact with many friends throughout Israel and Palestine and the larger diaspora. What we've heard from them is that Palestinians don't want our sympathy. They need urgent action to stop the violence.
As Reverend Mary Fontaine, the moderator of the Presbyterian Church of Canada, outlined in her letter to the Prime Minister, Canada has consistently stated its support for human rights charters and international law. However, Canada and the wider international community have failed to uphold international law and human rights equally for all people. This is literally read from her letter. The PCC urges the Government of Canada to call for an immediate ceasefire and opening a safe corridor to provide humanitarian relief, immediate and safe release of all hostages, restraint and de-escalation rather than militarized responses that will increase violence and lead to more deaths, and an end to the current blockade in Gaza and the increased violence against Palestinians living in Israel and the West Bank. The PCC also urges the Government of Canada to address underlying systems of oppression that create circumstances that perpetuate violence, including the 75-year Israeli military occupation of Palestine, the Gaza blockade, and the inequality of rights and self-determination of all Palestinians. She called us to work constructively towards a future where all Palestinians and Israelis can live in peace and where both define what they need for a just peace. As the song the choir is about to sing, I heard them practicing earlier, we are called to act for justice. And I said, I'm glad they sang that before we spoke because I will be a hot mess during it. And I want to point out that all of the medical staff and Meet Press who have been providing these stories for us have not had access to food and water for weeks now regularly. Like, they are losing weight and starving, and it is dire. So we wanted to end with a poem by a Palestinian poet, a famous Palestinian poet named Mahmoud Darwish. Oh, before I do that, this is why we have slides. If you would like to take action, as the moderator of the Presbyterian Church of Canada has, please write to your government officials, write to the Prime Minister, write to your MPs. You can also donate to PWS&D's Gaza Relief Fund, which I hear that some of you already have, so thank you so much for that. Also, continue talking about what's happening in Gaza to those in your community and online. And I was going to make an email up there to enter one to say updates for local events, but just talk to us after. If you're watching this online, please reach out to the church. They know how to put you in contact with us. So these are the words of Mahmoud Darwish. As you prepare your breakfast, think of others. Do not forget the pigeon's food. As you conduct wars, think of others. Do not forget those who seek peace. As you pay your water bill, think of others. Those who are literally being nursed by the clouds this week because it rained in Gaza. I edit that. As you return home to your home, think of others. Do not forget the people of the camps. As you sleep and count the stars, think of others who have nowhere to sleep. And as you liberate yourself in metaphor, think of others who have lost the right to speak. And as you think of others far away, think of yourself. Say, if only I were a candle in the dark. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Laura, very much for coming and sharing with us today. Often we don't have a really good sense of what's going on in different places around the world, and so we really appreciate that perspective that you bring for us today to enlighten us.